one of the many elements that motivated me to do this work is to sort of, generate a tremor on this very problematic foundational concept that we have authentic cultural practices or we have authentic now I have argued in my previous works as well in multiple patterns in multiple perspectives how the term authenticity is itself very problematic.
Good evening, one and all. I'm Antara Chakrabarty, and I welcome you all to Galp Lok. In today's episode of Bookmarked, a series of academic book discussions that we host on Galp Lok, we are very glad to have Dr. Sayan Dey with us with his new book, Performing Memories and Weaving Archives. It's an honor and personal privilege for me to have someone as young and talented scholar like Sayan Dey with us today. Before I go ahead and introduce you all to the book, I would like to welcome and introduce the author Sayan Dey and our first panelist, Dr. Shankhadeep Chattopadhyay, with all of you. Dr. Sayan Dey is from Kolkata, India, and is currently working as an assistant professor in the Department of Language and Literature, School of Liberal Arts, Alliance University, Bangalore. He is also currently working as a postdoctoral fellow at WITS Center for Diversity Studies, University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg. He is a faculty fellow, the Harriet Tubman Institute, York University, Canada. As a contributor and editor, his publications appear in different edited books, journals, blogs, and tabloids. His areas of interest are history, archaeology, everyday decoloniality, sociology, Indian Ocean studies, culinary epistemologies, and critical race studies. Our first panelist, Dr. Shankhadeep Chattopadhyay, is currently serving as an assistant professor, School of Liberal Arts and Science at Mody University of Science and Technology, Rajasthan. As a contributor and editor, his publications appeared in different journals, books, and online platforms. His areas of interest are popular music, cultural studies, everyday life, resistance studies, spatial literary studies, romantic literature, postmodernism, digital humanities, and more. Shankhadeep is also a creative writer at heart, a devout traveler, and a classic rock aficionado. The second panelist for today is me. I am currently a doctoral candidate in sociology at South Asian University, New Delhi, and also the chief editor of Galp Lok. My interest lies in diaspora, performance, and largely cultural studies. Now, coming to the book, Performing Memories and Weaving Archives, Creolized Cultures Across the Indian Ocean, is published in 2023 by Anthem Press. It is divided in 6 lucid chapters ranging from spiritual, culinary, musical memories as well as that of resistance. Usually, discourses on the planetary evolution and the movements of slaves remain restricted within the narratives and scholarships of the transatlantic slave trade and hardly engage with the evolution movements and shifts about the Indian Ocean world, in short, IOW slave trade. Despite the existence of these diverse archival documents on the IOW trade activities, any discourses on the IOW continue to remain an understatement. The narratives on the IOW of vast extent have been shaped by Western colonial historians who have imaginatively constructed the IOW within separate geographical, cultural, and epistemological ontological enclaves. Based on these socio historical arguments, this book unearths how Siddhis in Gujarat and the South African Indians in South Africa preserve their ancestral memories through spiritual, culinary, and musical practices on the one side and generate creolized socio cultural spaces of collective decolonial resistance and well being on the other. Now, with this, I would like to open today's platform of discussion and welcome our first discussant, Shankhadeep Chattopadhyay, to comment on his perusal of the book. So, over to you, Shankhadeep.
First of all, thank you, Antara, for inviting me to this panel and to this thought-provoking conversations regarding a book which is a need of this age, which is a need of this time, and the kind of the book that should be written on the kind of precarious socio-political circumstances that we are going through. First of all, as I have already mentioned in my review, that I like to thank the author for writing and processing his endeavor on such a topic. The book demands a lot of theoretical layers, a lot of nuanced theoretical layers, I would rather say, related to a kind of multidisciplinary perspectives that ranges from spatial studies to cultural studies to the kind of culinary practices, everyday life, resistance, and so forth. List goes on. Uh, the kind of theme that he has dealt with, it's terribly reflective in its mood, and the kind of idea that he shares with and wants to share in a kind of with his audience, that basically demands the author to come down to a praxis oriented level, practice oriented outlook, or like performative practice oriented outlook, I'd rather say. However, my perception and my reading of that book actually has driven me down to decategorize the kind of diasporic existence of both the communities that are residing in South Africa and are simultaneously in India. The book begins with a historical remark, pinched with a personal sentiment of feeling uprooted. And the one thing, it's pretty much certain that it demands a kind of interpretation of roots, ROOTS, and roots, which is the continuation, a journey, a path that the narrator is having here. First of all, there are three basic premises on which the author actually focuses: musical, spiritual, and culinary. Now, somewhere down his writing demands us to look at the particular diasporic community's practices as a counterculture. Somewhere down the kind of arguments, the kind of intense analysis of those diasporic communities' practices, as the author wants to go delve in, and then simultaneously, like, they feel that there should be some more prospects attached to that particular diasporic community's practices so that we can call it a counterculture. But the evidence are clear. The evidence are clearly marked, and the evidence are clearly marked regarding the kind of interreligious utopic framework that can be marked in South Africa, where the author describes that a Muslim community, a kind of indentured Hindu slaves, and all the kind of people, they are mingling together, constructing a kind of political utopia, carrying the taziyas of Muharram in a Hindu procession. So that's a uh, kind of much needed observation. A couple of South African scholars have observed such things, but what makes his observation different is neither he focuses on the kind of creation of this interreligious utopic communities and their practices to a particular specific location or areas, like limited to a particular specific location or area, but simultaneously his arguments do not overlap, as they like swiftly moves from one domain to another, one domain like their musical practices, putting some instances from there, and then moving to the culinary associations, where he starts like arguing about the kind of metaphysical and ontological significance of some particular food dishes. And such kind of the kind of argument, it basically produces a cultural battleground for the readers to come over to that cultural battleground, associate themselves with the disenfranchised lives of the Siddhis in Gujarat, or like native South African communities, or the indentured Hindu slave communities over there in Durban. And similarly, it's not like having a kind of straightforward outlook to a kind of revolutionary or rebellious portrayal of those diasporic communities, since these communities are existing continuously in a liminal zone, having a lot of turmoils, having a lot of like essential upheavals or like transformative zones. They're passing through several transformative zones while acquiring with the kind of land they are living right now, or the kind of social practice they are being other against, and a lot of things. But the thing is, while shifting to the end of this book, he mentions that whatever the grounds may be, there can be any other grounds, and many other grounds than these particular three specific points: culinary, spiritual, and musical. But the point is, how do we know about them? How do we recognize them? How do we know that while traveling as an Indian tourist in Ahmedabad, or traveling as an Indian tourist in Johannesburg, having taking a bus ride throughout the historical sites, looking at them, but not looking at the kind of communal difference, and especially the kind of community difference that lies across the lands, several places in India and several places in Africa also. School education system path, where we can introduce to school children about the existence of such geographic difference and in across the Indian Ocean, and the kind of archipelagic significance, one very significant things he talks about, um, to the school children from a very rudimentary level. So the overall remark is to making the reader aware, to create a new readership, to create a new milieu of readers who will think, come forward, who will take part, who will come down to the praxis, and who will look into the aspect that needs to be explored in a vivid dimension. Thousands of theoretical spectrums can be talked about in this for particular book, from an intellectual level, from a empathetic level. We can talk about liminal crisis, we can go on talking about liminal crisis to the end, and the kind of the idea of becoming that is associated with these diasporic community members, and the kind of ontological liminal crisis that these diasporic community people faces, and they're habituated with such crises that they do not want to come out as a transformative result. They want to stay just behind the limen. They do not want to cross the limen. So we can talk about that. We can talk about performative outlooks and the kind of personal sentimental values that are associated with the instruments that this diasporic community people use, especially his um, personal visit to Sitambar Alayam, which is an old Hindu, old temple where both the Indian indigent Hindus and Muslims, they go and pray and they have foods and they celebrate their rituals. And his visit to Gujarat, where he explores the Siddhi community in detail and explores the kind of the legend of Bava Gaur. Now, this particular figures, Bava Gaur, Mai Mishra, and these legends, these African legends, who were somewhere down in the time indentured slaves and had transported to Indian continents. But since a lot of scholars, it's not this is the first thing that is talking about Bava Gaur. No, people have talked about Bava Gaur. There are papers, there are researches regarding Bava Gaur, Mai Mishra, and their legends and the significance of the contemporary life of the Siddhis and how they're growing up. But the problem is, most of these researches that I found, they are pretty one-sided with the idea of otherization. So there has been a kind of authorial distance. So that distance actually gets pretty blurred, or he has attempted to make it blurred to some extent, where he talks about the kind of an age-old dhol, which is an Indian instrument, and the very existence that is lay barren in a ground, and the moment that dhol will be transformed to some participatory tool, surrounding that dhol, there are musical memories and there are spiritual memories. or there are foods which gets curried in both South African and Indian kitchen, but in different ways, in different values. They are consumed in different values. So such kind of aspects can only be envisaged when the author comes down to a motif of uh, contributing to some extent to the proper sense what we call theoretically a decolonial healing. But it's a long process, right? Healing doesn't happen like overnight. It takes life. It takes like entire span of life. But simultaneously, another interesting thing is the idea of their musical practices. Now, their musical practices are pretty diverse. Simultaneously, their musical practices are being capitalized too. They are falling, they're heavily falling into the vicious trap of like capitalism. They're being sold, they're being experimented, but somewhere down they're trying to keep their validation. They're trying to keep their cultural authenticity, cultural validation by performing their native music, and to make it popular they're helping the tunes of Bollywood songs, they're helping the tunes of new popular music traditions, and they want to consume it differently. So there has been a kind of path that is created here already. If we focus on the kind of consuming such music from modern perspective, the Siddhis music rather, some of them are having like being successful to this particular effort, and most of the people are like still they're in darkness, but because they do not have that awareness of it, that how to do it, how to practice DIY, having facing such everyday differences, whether traveling in bus they're racialized, they're having racialized remark, while the tourists are going to visit them, they are looking at them as they are the absolute other. They are not the part of regular Indian communities due to their skin color, due to their accent, and due to their like behavioral gestures. So the problem is, the more we go deeper into the anthropological perspectives, the more we be able to make the readership aware about how to look at anthropological problems or diasporic problems, the process of cooking, the process of intermingling spices, through which the labor migration and this indentured migration memories are continuously revoked by this community people. That opens up a new dimension for the other scholars to comment, to find out more new problems, the more layers of suppression against which this particular people are subjected to. This kind of practice oriented outlook is a much expected need, especially from the cultural studies and decolonial studies scholars, where the armchair intellectualism does not actually hold sway. So it's better to understand the perspective of an activist who wants to do something, whether through publishing books, papers, making people aware, or going to the places on like taking up things and taking up quirky and eccentric things to talk about and making people aware to a rudimentary level. So that's a very brief, and in a nutshell I can talk about this within a very brief time span.
Thank you so much, Shankhadeep, for your enlightening comments on the book. It does open a lot of spectrum of debates, be it oral history or discourses on diaspora, decolonial studies, and more. But before I start, I would like to say how this book very much resonates with my interest areas, which is memory, performance, and so on. And hence, I was significantly intrigued to get a good reading of this book. The book initiates us into several events, one being that of a mention of partition by the author Shayan, and how we talk about these different topographic nation states or subsequent process of memory keeping we see in the dispersed diaspora and so on. One thing that comes out vividly as a central anchor to me as a reader in the book being the role of oral history and how significant it may turn out to historians, literary specialists, and of course ethnographers. By ethnographers, I again don't mean like how Marcus would call it a circumstantial activist, but activism in true terms, while you are actually trying to bring out the otherness and the marginalized aspects which weren't being really looked at all these years in the colonial forms of knowledge making. In the words of James Clifford, I also see how do diaspora discourses represent experiences of displacement, of constructing homes away from home. What experiences do they reject, replace, or marginalize? How do these discourses attain comparative scope while remaining rooted or routed in specific discrepant histories? The political ambivalence, utopic, dystopic tensions of the diaspora visions, and of course, these things always get entangled in powerful global knowledge making systems we see. Even in India, as a colonized country, we see how there is furthermore processes of othering, as Shankhadeep already speaks about. Now, how does these things process? Let us see how. Now, such invisibilities are the product of an ongoing epistemological or psychological process of ignorance in another matter. As the book also shows, and speaking from a vantage point, probably yes, there is a clear affliction in the amount of discourse we are fed in the contemporary world of social scientific knowledge making, especially when we put it in the binaries of colonized and the colonizer based problematics. As Donna Haraway puts it, knowledges are always situated, never really an ahistorical paradigm. Hence, what can be done here is a reimagination of the political, social, cultural, musical, and oral historical lens which the book rightly addresses. In such lines, the book, I have to mention, presents a very thick description of such ethnographic and archival accounts, especially through the large scale mention of these pictorial instances of the fieldwork that were being carried out. The theme of colonial narratives shows an general abeyance towards African diaspora in India and the Indian diaspora in South Africa, and also the kinship based alliances, so to say. The subsequent creolization, if I have to put it through sociologist Robin Cohen words, that how creolization occurs when participants select particular elements from incoming or inherited cultures, they endow these with meanings different from those that were possessed in the original cultures, and then creatively merge these into new varieties that supersede the prior forms. In other words, in sociology, we might also call it a kind of cultural assimilation that the book mostly tries to put through. Here I also find it interesting where a part where the author Shandy introduces us to certain mnemonics and wordings that we call people by, like for example the African Indians in India are known as Siddhis or Habshis. Where are these etymologies coming from? How are they coming from in the colloquial discourse that we call such people by these names? Such narratives also revolve around the origin, as I already mentioned, and how these mnemonics come about throughout the years, becoming an understood knowledge system, an established framework of discourse that we talk about. In Walter Mignolo's words, we also see language, as mentioned earlier, as a domain of contestation as well, as linguistic hierarchy between European languages and non European languages that privileged the communication, the knowledge, theoretical production in the former, and the subalternized version of the latter, as sole producers of cultures and folklore, but not really giving them the onus of makers of knowledge and theory, but okay as a part of it's okay to be put them in the enclosures of folklore, myth, legends, or resistance, but not really a proper domain of knowledge producers or theory producers. Again, following the themes of creolization, the particular signs of interest areas that really, vividly imagines me as a reader and also experiencing the field experiences by the author, we see how intercultural and transnational folklore, cooking of dishes unique to regions, sacrifices, deities, gods, all these Afro Indian Creole languages and religious musical practices are really coming out through detailed experiences of the everyday lives of the people. Apart from the linguistic creolization and the intermingling of indigenous African spiritual practices, I also find it interesting how the author brings in the Sufi Islamic practices of India, the creolized spiritual practices of the Siddhis in Gujarat, which can also be located through their interreligious practices. The interreligious practices among Siddhis have centrally evolved over following many folklore narratives over the years and so on. Again, this is something which my previous panelist Shankhadeep rightly mentioned, that how these cultures are also falling prey to these online social media platforms like YouTube or Facebook, etc. How they are producing certain musical practices which are quite contrary to what they would imagine as the origin of how these folkloric performances used to be. But I also would like to add to this that it may be needless to say that how these efforts are also made to preserve and practice the traditional creolized cultures by mixing, keeping up with the contemporary generations, knowing that they are the ones who are mostly in the end of the consuming of these products, and it might keep up more with such public. So apart from such physical performances, we see social media platforms like Instagram, Facebook playing a very crucial role. And I found it really interesting where you mentioned about the chutney music of South Africa across the globe. Like there are YouTube channels named Chutney Music, Facebook groups like SA Indian Chutney, Instagram communities like chutney.music. These are really new forums that a lot of people might find interesting in the book, who might not be interested in, let's say, just diaspora or decolonial studies, but also people who are doing digital ethnography of also like oral history in a newer forms that we see. Now, instrumental roles that you have also spoken about, or the types of dance like dhamal, goma, etc. Several musical groups from South Africa also perform at such chutney music festivals across the world, which I think the readers would really find it interesting to, have a glance at. Now, all Indians on the ship, as we have seen and also shown by the author Sayan Dey, how we talk about the passage of these cultures through a particular Indian Ocean perspective, and looking at it beyond slave or let's say labor migration, but also from a cultural and performative lens, which again is quite a lesser treaded path. Whenever we talk of cultural studies, we mostly think of the dominant forms, but not really how these cultures are passed on through diasporic communities and more. um, the presence of work, how Shande also tries to look at the caste based differences which were otherwise not present, the hierarchy which were otherwise not present until then, has also started getting quite popular right now in the high caste Hindus present in South Africa and the entrance of passenger Indians. How high caste Hindus in South Africa began creating caste based socio-cultural divisions to preserve their cultural ties to India. On another instance, the creolized musical and dance practices of the Siddhis in South African communities, Indians, have generated multiple sites of trans-cultural and trans-local belongings, reminding me of how Akhil Gupta talks about mobility turns, that how even in field studies, there are multiple locales that we can look at. And in these multiple locales, we see different mobilities of different kinds. And in this case, a very important performative mobility turn that we are looking at through dance or musical or culinary practices. The transnational and translocal cultural sites have reproduced these so called ancestral cultural traditions, if at all there was an authentic one that we are talking about, and created and recreated a home place of new settings for such communities. It is worth holding historical and geographical importance of these paradigms. Two very important notations that I feel as a reader intrigued me most was the terms called borders and diaspora while dealing with the two paradigms and then subsequently the structures that we see. In the forms of diasporic longing, disidentification shared by broad spectrums of minority and such populations, these dispersed people nowadays with larger coming of made possible of modern technologies, communication, social media, as I just mentioned, looking at makes us help look at these diasporic communities than just looking at them from a political economic level. Now, as already mentioned, and the book definitely for sure brings about a new kind of debate within the decolonial studies, I feel that this book brings a very important and very interesting notation coming from decoloniality, in a sense where it is not just a kind of resistance and rejection, rebellion or resurrection or re-existence, but how can we exist despite the rejection of this new or different forms of order starting from the colonial histories? The book largely addresses what we see as an inception of the existence of being itself. Why can't we just look at it as a being itself rather than looking at it as a resurrection? It opposes a very strong, organized colonial setup of the colonial rule or colonial knowledge system. The author mentions in the book how, we are never introduced to such things in our history books within schools. We are always following the larger colonial setup of the so called the established rulers and ruling classes. But it is not just an attitude of resistance, but a new way of thinking, types of knowledge, possibilities, existence, and continuity of life outside that of this colonial framework. I feel there are a lot of fissures and cracks which were already presented in this colonial framework, but the book surpasses, even though it's coming outside from a colonial or colonial perspective, we cannot deny how the book presents a very strong spatial and temporal exertion that made very permanent dent in the so-called earlier forms of knowledge, but the book surpasses that and gives us a newer paradigms of such communities within Gujarat or the Indians in South Africa and so on. So this is my bit, but I would really like to welcome Shayan Dey, who has been waiting since then, and we would like to hear from you about your experience. And I would like to know more about your field experiences about the book and more to what Shankhadeep has already spoken about.
I mean, first of all, I want to extend my very warm and hearty regards to you, Antora, for setting up this space, for inviting us into the space, and to have such a powerful discussion. And also, Shankodeep and Antora for introducing the perspectives of this book so critically, or rather, I would put it as in a very critically diverse fashion, because I also come from my arguments also a lot emerge from the field of critical diversity literacy as well. So I usually use the term critically diverse quite often based on specific perspectives. Now, as both of you, there are so many elements to just take away, and I'm so glad that I'm the one who is speaking at the last, because honestly, I just wanted to hear, like, the readers like you, what they have thought about the work and what are their perspectives of analyzing the work. So it is a such a great pleasure to hear both of you of taking into account so many different dynamics at the same time. And somewhere somewhat, as an author, I would, secretly celebrate within myself that to a certain extent that the purpose of this project is solved, because one of the many purposes of this particular project was to open up this multi-dimensional avenues of understanding.
Mm,
Now, starting with what Shankodeep was mentioning, obviously about many things, but just to pick up certain selective perspectives, is where it is the book of the time. And why it is the book of the time? Because, you know, uh, it's a global phenomenon, I would say it as. I mean, it is happening. Maybe in our country, it's basically centered on religious perspectives, religious hierarchies. In some other countries, it's a racial hierarchical perspectives. In some other countries, it's from a cultural dimension. Some other countries from an economic dimension. But what we see is, this toxic growth of insularity towards other cultural practices is becoming a normative, celebrative aspect. And we know the dangers of it. We can already see that. I mean, I'm sure I don't need to sit here and justify why it is problem. When I was doing this project, or when I rather say started working on this project, conceptualizing project, laying the foundation in terms of field works, in terms of, and the book, you were also talking about my engagements with culinary cultures, my engagements with the different perspectives of history and sociology. So we often tell this, this is an Indian authentic cuisine, or we would often say it's a Bengali authentic cuisine, or it's a Punjabi authentic cuisine, or it's a Tamil authentic cuisine. But we use this to sort of generate a very highly questionable, chauvinistic perspective, which eventually, if it is logically decoded, doesn't really exist or work, because we are so much entangled and we are so much related with each other that all of us exist in different ways and patterns and perspectives in a very creolized way, in a very creolized fashion. And it is important to acknowledge that the creolization that I put forth, I have acknowledged in my book as well. But here also, I would like to acknowledge that this whole concept of cultural creolization, the theoretical perspective, obviously, I draw a lot from the works of historians like Ananya Jahanara Kabir, Professor Lewis Gordon, Rosina Mart, and Then you have several scholars across the world, and specifically people who has worked on the Siddhi community, though no one prior to me understanding or looking at the cities and the South African Indians from a creolized dimension. No one has done that previously, but a lot of works already have been going on across the world in terms of looking at ourselves, our evolution, our cultural evolution, our social evolution, our historical evolution from creolized lenses. Now, what we do, and also what Shankhadeep was also mentioning, you were also mentioning, Antara, about the archipelagic practices. And it is very important to understand, you know, whether we accept, whether we don't accept, that's a other issue, but we can't deny the fact, and it is very difficult to logically deny the fact that we are all, space of co-caring and co-sharing. Whether we want to acknowledge that, whether we don't want to acknowledge that, we cannot deny this truth. I mean, obviously, I cannot tell, even like, for instance, if you look at a lot of these food items that I mention in my chapters, like something like the chakalaka, right? Now, chakalaka, I take this example here because it's very famous across South Africa. Like, if you go to South Africa, in any sort of grocery shops, you get tinned and canned chakalaka sauces and all. Now, how this chakalaka came into being? I mean, on the one side, it has these very traditional Southern African culinary cultures, like usage of tomato purees, usage of beans, and all of these elements. But on the other side, you also see the heavy usage of dhania powder, jeera powder, garam masalas, chopped tomatoes, and many people, obviously they do it in their own. They make these sort of customizations in their own way as well in their respective households. If they want a bit more of the South African taste, or if they want a bit more of the Indian taste. But then you see the whole integration of, and now if you want to historically decode the whole evolution of chakalaka, that is where it opens up such a massive and critically diverse premise in front of us, right? I mean, why at all garam masala usage came into chakalaka? Like, it is obviously then has to do something with India, or let's say widely South Asia. Now, what has to do with India? And then this question, leads to this whole historical perspectives of indentured laborers and passenger Indians, and all of these folks and all of these people, right? So that is another very interesting, very sort of very fascinating perspective that you basically find as a part of this whole project, which brings us in front, whether you look at the South African Indians, whether you look at the cities, whether you look at the cities' histories and cultures and traditions, whether you look at the city, musical practices, and obviously, now one thing it is important to clear, that apparently, the South African Indians who derive their, ancestry from the indentured laborers, and the cities do not have an apparently a common connection. I mean, obviously, if you try to look at like if they had interacted with each other, or if they have like direct overlaps, so you don't find that. Then many people often ask me, then why exactly I have chosen these two communities? Now, this whole fragmented choice is itself a methodology for me. I mean, why every time I have to choose my perspectives, my spaces, or my places of research based on those clearly visible linkages that were once narrated and established by the colonizers, and we just sit there, look at the history books, derive our own ideas, paraphrase in our own words, and then we try to sort of furtherize those narratives, rather than trying to look into the fractures and the fragments through which knowledges are produced. I mean, if you look at a very, like, and as Shankati was also mentioning, like the decolonial lenses of anthropology, right? And anthropology, if I just take a small example of the anthropological space, you see it's still very much congested with colonial narratives, colonial linear narratives, right? But when you look at the one of the many ways of decolonizing that very comfortably hierarchized safe space is to break through and fracture it, fragment it, and most importantly, non linearize it. That is why apparently there are no connections. But what about understanding the sort of linkages that I bring as common grounds of creolization, with common grounds of music, with common grounds of food, with common grounds of spiritual practices? What about those linkages and obviously the Indian Ocean world connectivity, which is obviously there at the backdrop? What about looking at the Indian Ocean's world space through a completely new lens? A lens that is apparently fractured and fragmented, but also within those fractures, within those fragments, we can locate very strong and promising connectivities. And that is why the work is inconclusive. The work has to be inconclusive because this is a continuous process. And I have always been very uh, intellectually allergic, if I put it in that way, towards concluding works and drawing a fixated set of conclusions where I say, this is it. This is my finding, so this is the ultimate conclusion. No, it can never happen, which
Mhm.
actually happened in the past, sadly, with many of these historical works that have been generated around the city communities, that have been generated around the indentured Indian, South African Indian communities in South Africa. I mean, we talk about chutney music, but the moment you talk about chutney music, those who are kind of familiar with this particular term, the immediate thing is your mind rushes to the Caribbean islands,
Mm.
because in the Caribbean islands, in the Mauritius, all of these spaces, you see the chutney music is very prominent, and still it's very prominent. But chutney music in South Africa has also been an integral part. Yes, people have written about chutney music in bits and fragments. You see some references in articles, some references in newspaper OPEDs and all of these spaces. But why nothing has been written in such a in a structured, in a theoretical and methodologically structured way? And I personally felt that it is very crucial for me. It is very important for me to do it because it's important for us to the farthest possible extent. Again, I always tell people that this is an inconclusive work because these are not the only creolizations that these communities have. I mean, you
Mm.
can go for architectural creolization.
Mm.
Absolutely.
I mean, cities have a massive level of architectural creolization. The interesting thing is, and that also I just came to know a few weeks back. There is this, if you look at the logo of IIM Ahmedabad,
Mm.
the logo of IIM Ahmedabad, the design that you see is basically a representation of the design exactly that you see in the Sidi Sayed Mosque. And the Sidi Sayed Mosque in Ahmedabad was constructed by, Sidi Badsha, somebody named Sidi Badsha, who
Mm.
traces his ancestry from Ethiopia, right? But we know about IIM Ahmedabad. We know how does it function. If somebody asks you about the logo, you may be knowing the logo, but what is the history of the logo? How many of us know that?
Mm.
People, if you still question the people, there are African Indian communities in India. There is a strong Afro-Indian diaspora in India. People are still like shocked, surprised. It's like a revelation for them. Like, yeah, they know African students come to study in India, but they don't know there have been a 500-year plus history
Right.
of African diaspora in India, and they're like a stronghold. Like if you come to Hyderabad, if you come to Karnataka, even if you come to Karnataka, a lot of these local schools I know because my friends, my colleagues teach there. They do teach city children there who have their surname cities.
Mm.
And there are cities in in Gujarat, like across Gujarat, in Ahmedabad, in Gir, in lot of these localities you go, you find the cities in huge numbers. Still people, when it comes to representing India as a very, as always, as a country of those stereotypical imageries of equity, diversity, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and all of these, commercial dimensions to represent India and sell India to the world, then they never forget to call the cities and make them like project them as display objects in the museum right out open in the streets and make them dance. The sad part is when I was conversing with them and just asking them how comfortable they feel, they say that we not only feel uncomfortable, but the worst part is they want us to perform a kind of Africanness through those dancing, which we are totally oblivious of. Which we are totally oblivious of. Like you have to wear feather skirts, you have to paint your face with white paints, you have to wear feathered headgears, and you have to dance in a way, otherwise you don't get paid. The sad part is a lot of, obviously for ethical reasons I'm not going to take the names of the organizations, but a lot of these so-called government run social, cultural, historical organizations who fund their trips abroad to perform in cultural festivals to project India's cultural diversity only if they agree in a way that they want to do, not in a way that their communities have been historical practicing. So it is important for us to know, even to get into and question these stereotypes as well. It is extremely crucial, it is extremely important for us to know what are some of those historical dimensions that are rooted to these communities. In one of the chapter I also speak about the Swahili Creole language,
Hmm.
right? Which is again the sort of creolization we are habituated to understand, the linguistic creolization. How many of us, I remember, there is this really very reputed professor who works on the music history. Her name is Kathleen Gerasboy, and she's based in the Alpen School of Music in the US. And with her late husband, Nazir Bhai Jaira's boy, who was like a quite a famous ethnomusicologist and musicolinguist, and he has worked. Both of them are working together. They have been working together with the cities in Gujarat and making documentation of a whole set of Swahili words. First of all, those Swahili Creole words, how they got intermixed with the local Gujarati, Hindi, Urdu, Arabic, tongues of of Gujarat, and then what does it mean to them? And this is the kind of work that I did. I tried to locate the Swahili Creole words, how they preserve, how they sort of remember and remember their ancestry through these sort of musical performances. And where is that creolization located? Where are those Creole components located? And when you look at this music, I'm not the first one at all who has documented the zikrs. I'm not the first one at all. There are many folks previous to me. In fact, I have a whole archive of 120 zikrs which have already been recorded and kept out there. So it is right there. It's important to acknowledge these. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to look at the zikrs not just as a Sufi Islamist practice, which has been identified by scholars like Behrouz Shroff, Jasmine Graves, long time back, even before Behrouz and all of these people walked into the research scene. It was Helen Basu who started first ethnographically documenting the cultural practices of the cities back in the 70s, mid 70s. And they have documented endless zikrs. They have tried to locate how these zikrs actually has this Sufi Islamist musical performance of zikrs are very related to the Sufi Islamist musical practices of the Muslim communities in Sudan, right? There also you see very similar practices like spirit positions, same sort of drums being played. And interestingly, there it is known as dhikr, dhikr. What is known as zikr here, zikr, is known as dhikr there. So you see these linkages. But then my work, I feel in nutshell, obviously we can keep going on and on, but my work in nutshell is a continuation of this research works and invite the people to look at the world through a lens of a counter atlas, to look at the world through a lens that is not generated by the preconceived perspectives and notions and those ingrained ideologies of a colonial map.
Right.
Let us make these humble efforts to sort of invite people to think systemically, to think methodologically, that before drawing boundaries between ourselves,
Hmm.
before drawing cultural, social, religious, or whatever, racial, political, geopolitical, and what sort of boundaries between ourselves, let us rethink to what extent these boundaries are valid, to what extent these boundaries have a lifeline. Because the moment we are drawing a boundary, it is at that moment we are also eclipsing another set of boundaries. So without even realizing, often we are setting ourselves into a porous and fluid state. So is this space unavoidable? Obviously not. So let us rethink in the practical terms. I think I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shayan, for your contribution to our discussion and how you actually plan out the book in different parts. And I would really like to say, as a researcher, someone who is coming from a sociology, anthropology background, that the moment we talk about methodology, something that you pointed out is very, very important in thinking about such topics methodologically. Again, our methodologies are also clouded by these boundaries coming from the colonial anthropological framework of one particular field, boundaried, one particular community based study, thick description, etc. Even these debates are getting counter, what do I call it? Getting, a lot of counter arguments based on how to even uh, process these already present methodologies within themselves. Like, I remember one of our professors telling us that it all boils down to the different ways of seeing. How do you see a particular topic? Like you mentioned, that, nobody could even imagine that, these could have a different kind of performance to themselves, and not just how we imagine as an authentic, let's say, an African performance. So it all boils down to how we see differently, how we think differently. Probably the subjects are all there, but then how we take a different route to approach these topics. And you have beautifully done it in the book, opening this platform, as I always say, to the new readers, new scholars, in different fields, be it literature or sociology and more, to think in different lines and not just look at those already stereotypical ways of seeing, and think in newer dimensions, and locating these theoretical paradigms that one is introduced to in classroom spaces like decoloniality or diaspora or even culture, the idea of community as such. And
What actually made me curious after reading the book from Mollet to Mollet, uh, it's like what sort of radical pedagogical understanding can we derive, or what sort of new modes of pedagogical thinking can we imbibe or implement, so that there can be a mode of making the students or the children or the people across the ages who wants to know, make them aware regarding these communitarian spirits, practices, and cultural phenomenons, and simultaneously not drawing a line of otherness and wrapping a line of otherness regarding those communities, and to introduce them. Because what happens generally, the moment you pick up a disenfranchised community, the moment you pick up a racially otherized, politically otherized community, from that can be from any part of this world, and wants to make people aware about them, so people take them as subjects of understanding. Now that subjects, there are a kind of preconceived notion that gets implanted in them, that these are the subjects that we are learning, so there must be some sort of difference attached to it.
Hmm.
So as a mode of implicator, through a mode of implicator, or as like coming out with what sort of new pedagogical practices or the modes of thinking, where you can subtly remove the aspects of this preconceived notion of difference regarding the subject they are studying or knowing, what sort of new pedagogical mode of thinking you have planned so far, or you are thinking to come out with, to make people aware about such pedagogical notions, so that that can be implemented.
So yeah, thank you so much once again, Shankhadeep, for this again another set of perspectives. And I'm glad that you also raised this issue, which also Antora very well raised while she was sharing her viewpoints from the sociological perspective mostly, is about this whole the otherization of certain cultures and traditions. And it's important to understand that the otherization pattern not only happens always very vocally, it is that vocal perspectives of otherization that we are able to locate very categorically. But there are also forms of otherizations which happen in a very subtle and in such institutionalized ways. Whether you look at political institutions, educational institutions, even methodological institutions as well. I mean, I would look at this set of methodologies in the institute, where still a lot of this research takes place, unfortunately, by this by default attitude that because I come from a so called academic institution, I can just walk inside within a community and hunt and gather data from there and just forcefully take it, manipulate it in my own ways, and then I can put it in my own name. Now, where did we at all gather this cultural value and normalize? Obviously, it came from the colonial set of research methodologies, which also, I mean, if you look at this very fascinating work by Linda Tuhiwai Smith, that is decolonizing research methodologies, I mean, you find it how she, obviously, in a particular set of context in the Maori cultural system and all,
Hmm.
she openly criticizes it, right? Now, this book, in a way, is a warm and humble invitation to all the scholars to think. Now, this doesn't mean that one has to agree with me. One can totally disagree with me, can be very heavily critical of the book, but it's a warm and humble invitation to look at our societies, our cultures, our ways of learning and understanding in daily life. And for me, I believe this book is a sort of, this book involves with a lot of these research methods, apart from mentioning them at the introduction, but also as one goes through the chapters, in the way I sort of weave in the narratives with the theories and the practicalities and the images and all of these different, creative and academic and research components, even in those contexts, it's an invitation to think how we can use daily ways of our daily modes of our existence as a part of a research method. Otherwise, that gap that we keep on struggle to bridge between theory and praxis, no matter how much policies and how many books we are writing and finishing and getting awarded and rewarded for that, the problem keeps on persisting. Because we have to understand, we need to start from practice towards theory, not the other way around. Now my point is, there is no harm in making references. Obviously we need to make references, but when there is a difference of making a reference and just implanting a specific template and embossing it into my work just because it sounded very cool, it sounded something which is very attractive, or a person who has been multiple cited and all of these elements, but we shouldn't do that. And this work, if I look specifically from a very methodological lens, obviously this work serves as a very humble and warm invitation to sort of how to not only overcome these problems of implantations in our theoretical and methodological and practical understandings in research, but also to rethink this whole paradigm of research through multiple lenses that have not been so far spoken to a much extent. So, yes, I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
First of all, I would like to thank the author Shayan Dey for your time and considering to come to this platform and give your insights, and our panelist Shankhadeep Chattopadhyay, who agreed to be a panelist and give us such intriguing comments on the book and beyond. I think we are quite full in our platters today with this heavy discussion that we had, and I think it'll bring about a lot of inquisitiveness and curiosities within the audience and young students who are currently thinking of research areas that you could look at, or methodologies to include in their studies, be it from any discipline. As we already see that this book is not just marked by a disciplinary boundary, but it opens this platform to several students in several disciplines to come forward and think differently, as Shayande rightly tells us. So thank you so much. I will meet you people in the next episode of Galp Lok.